she wrote letters to her first love every day. Until one day, she received a surprising response. Every morning, a young woman writes a letter to the man who broke her heart, even though she believes he will never read them. She drops them into a quiet mailbox by a church garden and walks away. What she doesn't know is that someone has been taking those letters and sending them to him, and he's been reading every single one for years, but he never answered. Until now, one morning, a letter appears with her name on it, and what's inside isn't love. It's an apology, a confession, and a truth so painful. It changes everything she thought she knew. Why did he stay silent all these years? Who kept them apart? And now that the past has finally spoken, will this letter heal her heart? Or break it all over again? I'd love to know. Where are you watching from? Type it down below, and while you're here, subscribe so you'll always catch the next story. The first rays of sunlight crept through the curtains of Lena Whitcomb's small cottage, painting golden streaks across her quilted bedspread. Her eyes opened before her alarm could sound, just as they had nearly every morning for the past decade. She lay there for a moment, watching dust motes dance in the dawn light, feeling the familiar ache in her heart that always accompanied these early hours. With practiced movements, she slipped from beneath the covers and padded barefoot to her kitchen. The worn linoleum felt cool beneath her feet as she filled her copper kettle, a cherished gift from her grandmother, with fresh water. While it heated on the stove, she pulled her favorite mug from the cabinet, the one with tiny purple flowers that reminded her of the church garden. The morning ritual was as familiar as breathing. Earl Grey tea, 1 sugar, a splash of milk. Steam curled up from the mug as Lena carried it to her small kitchen table, where a wooden box waited. Her fingers traced the grain of the wood before lifting the lid, revealing dozens of carefully folded letters inside. "Good morning, Jonah," she whispered, her voice barely disturbing the morning quiet. She selected one of the older letters, its creases soft from repeated handling. Her own neat handwriting filled the page, words written 3 years ago but still sharp with emotion. "Dear Jonah, remember that summer evening when we sat in the garden and watched the fireflies? You said they were like stars that had fallen to earth, too beautiful to stay in heaven. I didn't tell you then, but that's how I felt about us." Lena folded the letter carefully, replacing it in the box. Fresh paper waited on her table, cream-colored and smooth. Her pen moved across it with gentle purpose, recording thoughts she never expected anyone to read. "Dear Jonah, the magnolias are blooming early this year. They always make me think of that spring when we first met, how you reached up and plucked one blossom for my hair. Your hands were trembling, though you tried to hide it. I've learned so much about strength since then, how it isn't about never trembling, but about continuing on despite the shake in your hands." The words flowed easily, years of unspoken feelings finding their way onto paper. Lena wrote about her work at the library, about the children who came for story time, about the way the morning light reminded her of his smile. She wrote without bitterness, each word carrying the weight of acceptance and grace she'd fought hard to find. When she finished, she read it over once, then folded it precisely into thirds. The envelope was already addressed, though she knew it would never be delivered. Some habits were too precious to break, even when they brought a touch of pain. Lena dressed carefully in a flowing skirt and simple blouse, her movements unhurried. She slipped on comfortable walking shoes and gathered her things. The letter, her house keys, and a small gardening trowel. She often used to help tend the church flowers. The morning air wrapped around her like a familiar embrace as she stepped outside. Dew sparkled on her small front lawn, and birds called their morning songs from the oak trees lining her street. The walk to church was short, just 3 blocks of quiet residential streets where azalea bushes nodded their colorful heads in the morning breeze. The church garden was her favorite place in town, a hidden paradise of carefully tended flowers and quiet corners. The old wooden mailbox stood near the back, partially hidden by a climbing rose bush. Years ago it had been used for prayer requests, but now it served as her private confession booth, holding letters that would never be sent. Lena's fingers lingered on the envelope before she slipped it through the slot. "Goodbye for now," she whispered, touching the weathered wood once before turning away. She didn't see Iris Blackwell watching from behind the hydrangea bushes, didn't notice the younger woman's recognition flash across her face as she glimpsed the familiar handwriting. As Lena's footsteps faded down the garden path, Iris emerged from her morning gardening tasks. She stood before the old mailbox, her heart beating quickly as she remembered her brother's pain, his silence, the way he'd withdrawn from everyone after leaving town so abruptly 10 years ago. With gentle movements, she opened the mailbox and retrieved Lena's letter, her hands trembling slightly as she held this unexpected bridge between past and present. The morning sun continued its climb into the sky, casting dappled shadows through the garden trees. Iris held the letter close, understanding that she now carried something more precious than paper and ink. She held the possibility of healing, of truth, of long-awaited answers. She watched Lena's retreating figure until it disappeared around the corner, then carefully tucked the letter into her gardening apron, returning to her flowers with a mind full of possibilities. The morning sun streamed through stained glass windows as Iris Blackwell hurried through her front door, her gardening apron still dusted with soil from the church grounds. Her hands trembled slightly as she held Lena's letter, its familiar cream-colored paper soft between her fingers. She settled into her favorite armchair, the one that had witnessed countless hours of prayer and contemplation. "Oh, Lena," she whispered, carefully unfolding the pages. The handwriting was as elegant as ever, each letter formed with care and purpose. "Dear Jonah, time moves differently in the early hours. The world is quiet enough that I can hear my own thoughts, and they often turn to you. This morning, I watched a cardinal build its nest outside my kitchen window. It reminded me of that spring afternoon when we sat in the park, counting red birds and making plans that never came to be." Iris's eyes welled with tears as she continued reading. Lena's words were neither bitter nor accusatory, just honest, thoughtful reflections filled with grace. The kind of grace her brother desperately needed but wouldn't allow himself to receive. With determined movements, Iris retrieved a fresh envelope from her desk drawer. She wrote Jonah's office address in clear, bold strokes, tucking Lena's letter safely inside. The post office was just opening as she arrived, and she sent the envelope on its way with a quiet prayer. 20 miles away, in a sleek downtown office building, Jonah Blackwell stood at his floor-to-ceiling windows. His reflection stared back at him. Crisp suit, carefully knotted tie, everything in its proper place. Everything except his heart. "Mr. Blackwell?" His assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. "Your 10 o'clock is here, and this came in the mail." Jonah recognized the handwriting on the envelope immediately. His sister's. His stomach tightened. He knew what it would contain. Every few weeks, like clockwork, another letter arrived, another piece of his past that refused to stay buried. "Send them in 5 minutes," he replied, already opening the envelope with fingers that didn't quite want to cooperate. The cream-colored paper emerged, and his chest constricted at the sight of Lena's handwriting. He read quickly, professionally, as if it were just another business document. But his carefully maintained facade cracked as her words washed over him. The cardinal, the park, the plans they'd made. His hand gripped the edge of his desk until his knuckles went white. A memory surfaced, Lena's laugh, bright and clear as spring water, her eyes crinkling at the corners as she pointed out yet another red bird. "That's 7, she'd exclaimed. 7 has to be a lucky number." He'd agreed, thinking they'd make their own luck, build their own future. The intercom buzzed again, startling him back to the present. "Your 10 o'clock is waiting, sir." "Send them in," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. The fired letter disappeared into his desk drawer, joining dozens of others in their manila folder prison, each one a reminder of what he'd walked away from, what he'd been made to believe was the right thing to do. The rest of his day passed in a blur of meetings, phone calls, and decisions that would affect hundreds of employees. He was good at this part, the numbers, the strategies, the clear-cut choices. It was the messy, emotional stuff he couldn't handle. Wouldn't handle. Evening found him in his apartment, 30 stories above the city. The space was immaculate, decorated in shades of grey and blue, everything chosen for its clean lines and lack of sentiment. But the manila folder on his coffee table disrupted the careful order, like a shout in a library. Jonah loosened his tie and poured himself 2 fingers of scotch. He hadn't touched it yet when he reached for the folder instead. Lena's letters spilled out, arranged by date. Some of the earlier ones were worn at the creases from repeated reading, though he'd never admit to that. He added today's letter to the stack, his fingers lingering on the paper. The Cardinal story joined other memories she'd shared, the community garden they'd planted, the choir performances she still gave, the quiet moments of her life that she continued to share with him, even though he'd never responded. The scotch sat untouched as night fell over the city. Jonah remained on his leather couch, surrounded by letters and regret, his carefully ordered world feeling increasingly hollow. Outside his window, the city lights blurred into a constellation of artificial stars, each one as distant and unreachable as the possibility of making things right. He reached for his phone several times, his fingers hovering over Lena's name in his contacts, unchanged after all these years. But each time, his father's voice echoed in his head, reminding him of family obligations, of expectations, of the proper way things should be. The phone returned, to his pocket, unused. The letters went back into their folder, tucked away in the desk drawer that he always kept locked. But as he got ready for bed, following his usual evening routine with mechanical precision, Lena's words kept surfacing in his mind. The Cardinal building its nest, creating something new, something hopeful. While he sat in his pristine apartment, surrounded by everything money could buy and nothing that truly mattered. Sleep eluded him as he lay in bed, his thoughts circling like birds looking for a place to land. In the darkness, he could almost hear Lena's voice counting red birds, her gentle spirit shining through today's letter, just as it had through all the others. The guilt sat heavy in his chest, a familiar weight he'd carried for years, growing heavier with each unopened letter, each unspoken word, each passing day of chosen silence. The morning light filtered through Lena's kitchen window, casting a soft glow on her writing paper. She wrapped her hands around her favorite ceramic mug, letting the warmth of her chamomile tea seep into her fingers. The familiar scent of honey and flowers drifted up, bringing comfort as she settled into her daily ritual. Her pen moved across the page with practiced ease. "Dear Jonah," she wrote, pausing to gather her thoughts. "Today I walked past the old bakery where we used to get those cinnamon rolls you loved so much. It made me smile instead of cry. And that's progress, isn't it?" Lena's hand moved steadily across the page as she continued writing. "These letters have become my way of making peace with the past. With each one I feel the sharp edges of hurt getting smoother, like sea glass tumbled by waves. I'm learning that forgiveness isn't about understanding why something happened. Sometimes it's about accepting that we may never know and choosing to heal anyway." She glanced at the small, potted succulent on her windowsill, the one that had survived, despite her occasional forgetfulness to water it. "Life goes on," she wrote, "and we grow in unexpected ways. I hope wherever you are, you've found your path to peace too." Across town, sunlight bounced off the sleek glass buildings of the business district as Iris Blackwell made her way through the revolving doors of her brother's office building. The security guard nodded in recognition as she headed to the elevator, her sensible shoes clicking against the polished floor. Jonah was already waiting in the lobby when she arrived, his tall frame wrapped in an expertly tailored suit that seemed more like armor than clothing. "Right on time," he said, giving her a quick hug that felt slightly stiff. They walked to their usual lunch spot, a quiet cafe tucked away from the bustle of downtown. After they ordered, a club sandwich for him, soup and salad for her, Iris took a deep breath. It was time. "I need to tell you something," she began, watching her brother's face carefully. "I've been forwarding Lena's letters to you for years now." Jonah's hand froze halfway to his water glass. His face, usually carefully controlled, showed a flash of surprise before settling into something more guarded. "You've what?" "She writes them almost every day." Iris continued gently. "Leaves them in the church garden mailbox. I don't think she expects anyone to read them, but I couldn't let them just sit there, gathering dust." The waiter arrived with their food, creating a momentary pause in the conversation. Jonah methodically arranged his napkin, buying time before he had to respond. "You shouldn't have gotten involved," he finally said, but there was more weariness than anger in his voice. "Maybe not," Iris agreed, stirring her soup. "But I've watched you read every single one. You keep them all, don't you?" Jonah's shoulders tensed. "That's not the point." "Then what is the point?" Iris leaned forward, her voice soft but insistent. "You never believed what Mom and Dad said about her, did you? About her only dating. You to help her family get ahead?" "No." The word came out rough, like it had been dragged from somewhere deep inside him. "I never believed that. Not for a second." "Then why?" "Because I was a coward." Jonah cut her off, his voice low and intense. "Because I listened to their threats about cutting off support to the community center where her mother worked. Because I convinced myself that leaving without explanation was better than watching her choose between me and her family's stability." He pushed his barely touched sandwich away. "I caused enough damage. Opening old wounds won't help anyone." Iris reached across the table, covering her brother's clenched fist with her hand. "Those wounds never really closed, Jonah. Not for either of you. Maybe it's time to stop hiding behind guilt and do something about it." The tension in Jonah's hand slowly eased under his sister's touch. Around them, the lunch crowd chattered and moved, oblivious to the weight of the moment unfolding at their table. "I'll think about it," he finally said, meeting his sister's concerned gaze. "That's all I can promise right now." "That's a start," Iris said, squeezing his hand before letting go. She could see the conflict in her brother's eyes, the longing to make things right, warring with the fear of causing more pain. Back in her home, Lena sealed her latest letter with care, smoothing down the envelope's edges. She didn't know these letters were being read, didn't know they were reaching the person they were meant for. But somehow, writing them had become as essential as breathing, each one a step forward on her path to healing, each word a small piece of the peace she was slowly building within herself. The church garden mailbox waited for her letter, as it did every day. As she slipped the envelope inside, a butterfly landed on a nearby flower, its wings opening and closing in the warm afternoon light. Lena watched it for a moment, thinking about how something so delicate could be, strong enough to transform itself completely. Sometimes, she thought, That's exactly what healing feels like. Jonah's head throbbed as he climbed the stairs to his apartment. The conversation with Iris at lunch had stirred up emotions he'd tried to bury for years. His chest felt tight, probably from stress, he told himself. He loosened his tie and fumbled with his keys. Inside, he dropped his briefcase by the door and headed straight for the kitchen. The pressure in his chest increased. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool air conditioning. His vision blurred around the edges as he reached for a glass of water. The glass slipped from his trembling fingers, shattering on the tile floor. Sharp pain shot through his chest like a vice grip. His knees buckled. As he collapsed, his last coherent thought was of Lena's latest letter, still unopened in his jacket pocket. The next thing he knew, harsh fluorescent lights assaulted his eyes. Steady beeping from monitors filled his ears. A nurse in blue scrubs adjusted something on his IV line. "Welcome back, Mr. Blackwell," she said with a gentle smile. "You gave us quite a scare last night." Jonah tried to speak, but his throat felt raw. The nurse offered him ice chips. "Your sister's been here all night," she continued. "She just stepped out to get coffee. The doctor will be in shortly to discuss your condition." As if on cue, Iris rushed back into the room, coffee forgotten in her hands. "Thank God you're awake!" Her eyes were red from crying. "When your neighbor called about hearing the crash..." The doctor, a woman with silver-streaked hair and kind eyes, entered with a tablet in hand. "Mr. Blackwell, I'm Dr. Martinez. You experienced a severe cardiac episode brought on by stress and overwork. We've diagnosed you with stress-induced cardiomyopathy. It's serious but treatable with proper care and significant lifestyle changes." Jonah listened numbly as she explained the treatment plan. Medication, rest, stress reduction, regular checkups. The words, "could have been fatal if untreated," echoed in his mind. When they were alone again, Iris pulled a familiar stack of letters from her purse. "I brought these from your office. Thought you might want them." Jonah's hands shook as he took them. "Thanks," he whispered hoarsely. Throughout the morning, as nurses came and went, Jonah reread Lena's letters. Each one was filled with such grace, such honest reflection. No blame, no bitterness, just pure, open-hearted processing of their shared past. "I forgive you," she'd written in one letter, "not because you asked, but because holding on to hurt only hurts me more." In another, "Sometimes I wonder if you ever think of me, but then I realize it doesn't matter. These letters aren't really for you anymore. They're for me, helping me understand my own heart better." Tears blurred his vision as he read letter after letter. How many years had he wasted, trapped in his own guilt and fear? How many chances had he missed to make things right? "Iris," he called softly to his sister, who sat quietly reading by the window. "Could you bring me some paper and a pen?" She smiled knowingly and pulled a notepad from her bag. "Already got them." Jonah stared at the blank page for several minutes, his heart monitor beeping steadily in the background. Finally, he began to write. "Dear Lena, I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I need to tell you how sorry I am. Sorry for leaving without explanation. Sorry for letting my father's prejudices and threats control my actions. Sorry for not being brave enough to fight for what mattered most. You deserved so much better than my silence. I've read every letter you wrote, treasured every word, even though I had no right to them. Your grace and strength humble me. This isn't a plea to rekindle what we had. That wouldn't be fair to you. This is simply the long overdue apology you deserve. I almost died last night. It made me realize how many things I've left unsaid, how many wrongs I've left unaddressed. I couldn't bear the thought of leaving this world without you knowing the truth. With deepest regret and respect, Jonah." He read it over twice, then carefully folded it and slipped it into an envelope. His hands trembled, but this time not from weakness, from the weight of finally speaking his truth. "Iris," he said, holding out the sealed letter. "Would you deliver this to her? Quietly, please. No big gesture, just make sure she gets it." Iris took the envelope with gentle reverence, understanding the courage it had taken to write those words. "I will," she promised softly. As she left the hospital room, Jonah closed his eyes, feeling lighter despite the monitors and tubes. For the first time in years, he could breathe freely, even with his weakened heart. The truth was finally set free, carried in his sister's caring hands to the woman who had never stopped writing. The early morning air hung crisp and cool as Iris made her way through the church garden, her footsteps leaving gentle impressions in the dewy grass. Her brother's letter felt heavy in her hands, not from its physical weight, but from the years of unspoken words it contained. She approached the weathered mailbox, its white paint slightly chipped from years of sun and rain, and carefully placed the envelope inside. Pausing for a moment, she said a quiet prayer. "Lord, guide their hearts." Her whispered words dissolved into the morning mist as she turned and walked away, hoping she'd done the right thing. Hours later, Lena followed her usual path through the garden, her mind already composing today's letter. The familiar rhythm of her footsteps faltered when she opened the mailbox. There, instead of empty space, lay a cream-colored envelope with her name written in handwriting she hadn't seen in nearly a decade. Her hands trembled as she lifted it out. "Oh, my goodness," she whispered, her heart thundering against her ribs. She stumbled to a nearby wooden bench, barely feeling the dampness that had collected on its surface. For several long minutes, she just stared at her name, written in Jonah's precise strokes. The sight brought back memories of notes passed in college, birthday cards, and their last Valentine before everything fell apart. Her fingers traced the edges of the envelope as tears blurred her vision. "Get it together," she told herself firmly, blinking away the moisture. With careful movements, she opened the envelope, unfolded the letter, and began to read. "Dear Lena, I owe you an apology that's been years in the making. I've received every letter you've written. My sister Iris has been forwarding them to me. Each one has been a reminder of my cowardice and the pain I caused. I never believed you betrayed me. That was a lie my family constructed, and I chose to accept it rather than fight for what I knew in my heart was true. I let fear and family pressure drive me away from the best person I've ever known. Yesterday, I collapsed in my apartment and was rushed to the hospital. The doctors say I have a serious heart condition, treatable, but a wake-up call nonetheless. Lying in this hospital bed, reading through your letters again, I realized how much time I've wasted carrying this burden of guilt. You deserve to know the truth. My parents threatened to cut off my college funding if I continued dating you. They manipulated the situation, spread rumors, and God help me, I chose the easy path instead of standing up for what was right, for what was real. I don't expect or ask for forgiveness. I just needed you to know that none of it was your fault. You were always the stronger one between us. With deep regret, Jonah." Lena lowered the letter to her lap, her hand steady despite the emotional earthquake within her chest. A bird sang somewhere nearby, its cheerful notes a strange counterpoint to the heavy silence in her heart. She sat there for a long while, watching the morning, sun climb higher in the sky, letting the words sink in. When she finally stood, her movements were careful, deliberate. She folded the letter with precise creases and slipped it back into its envelope. The walk home felt both longer and shorter than usual, each step carrying her through a whirlwind of memories and emotions. In her kitchen, she made tea as always, but today she added an extra spoonful of honey, a small comfort for her churning stomach. The familiar scent of chamomile filled her small space as she sat at her writing desk, pulled out her favorite pen, and began to write. The words came slowly at first, each one weighted with consideration. She paused often, sipping her tea, looking out her window at the maple tree that had just started turning golden at its edges. As the afternoon light shifted across her desk, the letter took shape. Dear Jonah, your letter found me this morning. After all these years of writing into silence, seeing your handwriting was like hearing a voice I'd convinced myself I'd forgotten. I accept your apology. The young woman I was needed it desperately, and the woman I am now appreciates its honesty. But what I need most now is not apologies, it's truth. Complete truth, however difficult it might be to share or receive. I'm sorry to hear about your health. Despite everything, I never wished you harm, and I pray for your recovery. Perhaps this is God's way of showing us that time is too precious to waste on half-truths and unspoken words. Whatever happens next, let it be real. Sincerely, Lena. She read it over once, twice, then folded it carefully and slipped it into an envelope. The sun was setting as she walked back to the church garden, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. The evening air had grown cool, carrying the scent of autumn leaves and distant wood smoke. At the mailbox, Lena hesitated for just a moment, her hand resting on its cool metal surface. Then, with a quiet determination, she opened it and placed her letter inside. As she closed the lid, the soft click seemed to echo with finality in the gathering dusk. A gentle breeze stirred the flowers around her, and somewhere in the distance, church bells began to toll the hour. Lena stood there for a moment longer, watching as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, before turning toward home with measured steps, leaving her words, and whatever might come of them, in God's hands. The morning sun filtered through the hospital room's curtains as Iris knocked softly on the door. Jonah looked up from his breakfast tray, his face brightening slightly at the sight of his sister. She held up a familiar cream-colored envelope, and his heart skipped a beat. She wrote back. Iris said simply, crossing the room to hand him the letter. Jonah's fingers trembled as he took the envelope. The monitors beside his bed showed a slight increase in his heart rate. He swallowed hard, looking at the neat handwriting that addressed the letter simply, to Jonah Blackwell. "Do you want me to stay?" Iris asked gently, already knowing the answer. He shook his head. "I need to read this alone." After Iris left, Jonah carefully opened the envelope, unfolding the single page inside. The morning light caught the slight indentations of Lena's pen strokes on the paper. "Dear Jonah," he read silently. "Your letter was unexpected, but I am grateful for your honesty. I accept your apology. After all these years, I've learned that understanding matters more than blame. I'm sorry to hear about your illness and pray for your recovery. If you're willing, I would appreciate knowing the whole truth of what happened between us, not for the sake of rekindling what was lost, but for the peace that comes with clarity. Lena." Jonah closed his eyes, relief washing over him like a cool wave. The knot of anxiety he'd carried since sending his first letter began to loosen. She hadn't rejected his words or responded with anger. Instead, she'd offered grace. He wasn't sure he deserved. He reached for the bedside table where the nurses had left some paper and a pen. His hand was steadier now as he began to write. "Dear Lena, thank you for your kindness in responding. You always had a generous heart, and I see that hasn't changed. The truth you deserve to know has weighed on me for years. My family, especially my father, had certain expectations about who I should marry. When he discovered how serious we were becoming, he didn't approve of our relationship. Not because of who you are, but because you didn't fit his narrow vision of our family's social standing." Jonah paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "I was young and weak. Instead of standing up to him, I let his threats about my future in the family business influence me. He implied he would make things difficult for you professionally if I didn't end things. I convinced myself I was protecting you by leaving without explanation, but I was really protecting myself from having to make a difficult choice. It was cowardly, and you deserved so much better." The words flowed more easily now, years of unspoken truth finally finding their way onto paper. "I've carried the shame of that decision every day since. When Iris told me she'd been forwarding your letters, I couldn't bring myself to respond. How could I admit what I'd done? But this health scare has shown me the cost of living with unspoken truths. I hope this explanation brings you the peace you seek. You were never at fault, and I am truly sorry for letting fear and family pressure destroy something beautiful." Later that afternoon, Lena stood in the church garden, another envelope in her hands. The late summer breeze rustled through the flowers Iris tended so carefully. She found her usual bench, settled beneath the shade of an old oak tree, and opened Jonah's letter. As she read his words, tears gathered in her eyes but didn't fall. Each sentence filled in another piece of the puzzle she'd turned over in her mind for so long. The truth hurt, but it was a clean kind of pain, like antiseptic on an old wound. The mystery that had haunted her thoughts finally had shape and substance. It wasn't love that had failed them, but courage. Not a lack of feeling, but a surrender to fear. Somehow that made it easier to accept. She sat there for a long while, letting the words sink in, feeling the weight of years of uncertainty slowly lift from her shoulders. The anger she'd expected to feel didn't come. Instead, she felt something closer to compassion. For the young man Jonah had been, for the choices he'd struggled with, even for herself, and all the time she'd spent wondering. That evening, Lena knelt beside her bed, the familiar posture of prayer bringing comfort as it had so many times before. The soft glow of her bedside lamp cast gentle shadows on the walls as she bowed her head. "Lord," she whispered, her hands clasped tightly, "thank you for answers to prayers I've carried so long. Grant me wisdom to know what to do with this truth. Help me see clearly not just with my eyes, but with my heart." She paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "I don't ask for restoration of what was lost. Instead, I ask for guidance on the path ahead. Show me how to move forward with grace and understanding. Help me find the peace that comes from letting go of questions and embracing your plan for my life." The room was quiet except for the soft sound of her breathing and the distant chorus of evening crickets. In that stillness, Lena felt a subtle shift in her heart, not the dramatic closure she might once have hoped for, but something quieter and more profound. Acceptance. She remained there, eyes closed, letting the peace of the moment wash over her. The truth she'd longed for had finally come, and while it hadn't erased the past, it had given her something she needed even more, the freedom to move forward without the weight of uncertainty. The morning sun painted golden streaks across Iris's face as she walked through the hospital corridors, her steps light but purposeful. In her hand, she held Lena's latest letter, sealed with care and heavy with meaning. The rhythmic beeping of medical equipment provided a steady backdrop as she approached Jonah's room. Her brother sat propped up against starched white pillows, looking less pale than the day before. His eyes brightened at the sight of the envelope. "You're getting better at this delivery service than the post office," he said, attempting a weak smile. Iris placed the letter in his hands. "Just doing what needs to be done." She squeezed his shoulder gently. "Take your time with it. I'll be back later." Once alone, Jonah carefully opened the envelope, his hands steadier than they'd been in days. The familiar sight of Lena's neat handwriting made his heart squeeze with a different kind of ache than the one that had brought him here. "Dear Jonah, He read softly to himself. Your words, about family pressure and fear, ring true to me. I remember how your mother would look at me during church services, her disapproval barely hidden behind polite smiles. I think I always knew there was more to your leaving than what appeared on the surface. But knowing doesn't always ease the hurt. He paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. Lena's words were gracious but honest, describing years of questioning and pain that had eventually led her to a deeper faith. She wrote about learning to pray for him instead of blame him, about the slow process of letting go of bitterness. In his hospital room, surrounded by monitors and medication schedules, Jonah reached for the notepad on his bedside table. His response flowed more easily this time, filled with memories of their shared past, simple moments he'd held on to through the years. He wrote about their first meeting at the church youth group, how her quiet wisdom had drawn him in. He described the afternoon they'd spent, painting sets for the Christmas pageant, covered in gold glitter and laughing until their sides hurt. Each memory came with an acknowledgement of what his silence had cost them both. Across town, Lena sat in her garden, reading Jonah's latest letter during her lunch break. The spring breeze rustled through her carefully tended roses as she absorbed his words about those same shared memories, seen through his eyes. A cardinal landed on her bird feeder, its bright red feathers catching the sunlight. Lord, she whispered, thank you for this healing, even if it's different than what I once hoped for. She went inside to write her response, her tea growing cold beside her as the words poured out. She wrote about her journey through grief to acceptance, about the peace she'd found in serving others at church, about the way God had used her pain to deepen her compassion for others who felt abandoned. When Iris arrived at the hospital that afternoon with Lena's response, she found Jonah, sitting up in a chair by the window, looking more like himself. The doctors say I might be able to go home in a few days, he told her, accepting the envelope with gentle reverence. That's wonderful news, Iris said, noting how her brother's hands trembled slightly, not from weakness this time, but from emotion. After she left, Jonah read Lena's words slowly, pausing often to wipe his eyes. Her description of finding purpose in pain, of choosing forgiveness over bitterness, humbled him deeply. He picked up his pen one more time that day, his heart full of gratitude and something that felt like hope. In this letter, he wrote about his own spiritual journey, the years of running from guilt, the endless work hours that couldn't fill the void his choices had created, the recent wake-up call that had brought him to this hospital bed. He described how her letters, saved and reread countless times, had been a thread of grace he hadn't deserved, but desperately needed. Then, after a long moment of consideration, he added a question at the end. Would you be willing to meet with me, just to talk? I understand if you're not ready, or if you'd rather keep this distance between us. But if you're willing, I'd like to apologize in person and hear more about your journey face to face. That evening, as Iris delivered his letter to the church garden mailbox, the setting sun cast long shadows across the peaceful space. She said a quiet prayer as she slipped the envelope inside, knowing these exchanges were about more than just two people finding closure. They were about the power of truth to heal old wounds, about the way God could use even years of silence to prepare hearts for reconciliation. Lena discovered the letter as twilight settled over the garden. She sat on her favorite bench, the one surrounded by lavender plants, and opened it carefully. As she read Jonah's words about his own spiritual growth and his request to meet, a profound sense of peace washed over her. The answer wasn't immediately clear, but she knew she could trust God's timing, just as she had through all the years of writing those seemingly unread letters. The night wrapped around her like a gentle blanket as she looked up at the emerging stars, holding the letter close to her heart. Whatever her answer would be, She knew these exchanges had already brought something beautiful out of the ashes of their past. Not the romance she'd once dreamed of, but something perhaps more valuable. The possibility of genuine healing and growth for them both. The morning sun painted long shadows across the church garden as Lena placed her response in the mailbox. Her hand trembled slightly as she wrote just 2 words, "I'll come." By early afternoon, she found herself walking through the hospital's automatic doors, her sensible flats making soft sounds against the polished floor. A kind volunteer directed her to the garden, a peaceful space filled with raised flower beds and wrought iron, benches, the sweet scent of jasmine mixed with the sterile hospital air. Jonah was already there, sitting on a bench beneath a flowering dogwood tree. He looked thinner than she remembered, wearing a navy sweater despite the warm day. When he saw her, he started to stand, but she gestured for him to stay seated. "Please don't get up," Lena said softly. She settled on the opposite end of the bench, leaving space between them. A gentle breeze stirred the dogwood blossoms, sending white petals drifting around them. For a long moment, neither spoke. The only sounds were distant traffic and birds calling from nearby trees. Lena folded her hands in her lap, noticing how her fingers twisted together, an old nervous habit. "Thank you for coming," Jonah finally said, his voice quiet but steady. "I wasn't sure you would." "I wasn't sure either," Lena admitted. She looked at the garden instead of at him. "But I've spent years writing letters you never saw, or so I thought. It seemed right to finally speak the words out loud." Jonah nodded slowly. "I read every one. They're all in my office, in the bottom drawer of my desk. I just couldn't bring myself to respond." "Because of your family?" Lena asked, though she already knew the answer from his recent letters. "Partly," he said. "My father made it clear what he thought about us. But mostly it was my own cowardice. I believed his lies about you because it was easier than standing up to him, than standing up for what I knew was right." A monarch butterfly landed on a nearby lantana bush, its wings opening and closing slowly. Lena watched it as she gathered her thoughts. "You know what hurt the most?" she said finally. "Not that you believed I'd betrayed you, but that you never asked me, never gave me a chance to explain or defend myself. You just disappeared." Jonah's hands gripped the edge of the bench. "I know, and I'm so sorry, Lena. I was young and weak and afraid, but that's no excuse." "No," she agreed quietly. "It's not." They sat in silence again, but it felt different now, cleaner somehow, like the air after rain. "I want you to know," Lena continued, "that I forgave you a long time ago. Not for your sake, but for mine. I couldn't keep carrying that weight." "The letters helped." "They did. Writing to you, or who I thought was just a memory of you, helped me understand my own heart better. Helped me heal." Jonah turned slightly towards her, though still keeping his distance. "I've read them so many times, I practically know them by heart, especially the one about the summer carnival, when we rode the Ferris wheel and got stuck at the top." A small smile touched Lena's lips. "We watched the sunset and shared that bag of cotton candy. You kept saying we were closer to heaven up there." "We were," Jonah said softly. "In more ways than one." The butterfly took flight, dancing on the breeze before disappearing over the hospital roof. Lena watched it go, feeling an unexpected lightness in her chest. "I'm not the same person I was then," she said, "and neither are you." "No," Jonah agreed. "But maybe that's not a bad thing. We've both grown, learned hard lessons." "Yes," Lena nodded, "though I wish the lessons hadn't cost us both so much pain." A nurse walked past, checking her watch. The afternoon shadows had lengthened, and Lena knew it was time to go. "I should head home," she said, standing slowly. I hope you recover fully from your heart condition." Jonah remained seated, but looked up at her with clear eyes. "Thank you. Not just for coming today, but for teaching me about real forgiveness through your letters, even when you thought I'd never read them." "That's the thing about forgiveness," Lena said. "It's not about the other person reading it or hearing it. It's about letting go." She adjusted her purse strap on her shoulder and took a step away from the bench. "Goodbye, Jonah." "Goodbye, Lena," he replied softly. "And thank you." That evening, Lena sat at her familiar kitchen table, a fresh sheet of paper before her. Her tea grew cold as she wrote, describing the afternoon's meeting with a sense of peace she hadn't expected to feel. "Today I finally spoke to the man I've been writing to all these years," she wrote, "and I realized something important. The letters were never really for him. They were for me. Each word I wrote was a step toward healing, toward understanding myself better. Now, sitting here in my quiet kitchen, I feel lighter. As if the last weight I didn't even know I was carrying has finally been set down." Across town in his hospital room, Jonah was writing too. His doctor had suggested journaling might help with stress management, but tonight the words flowed for a different reason. "I saw Lena today," he wrote. "After all these years of reading her letters in secret, of carrying the burden of my silence, we finally spoke face to face. She has more grace than I deserve, more wisdom than I remember. She taught me that true forgiveness isn't about erasing the past. It's about finding peace with it. Tonight, for the first time in years, I feel truly forgiven. Not just by her, but maybe finally by myself too." That night, as the same moon shone over their separate homes, both Lena and Jonah slept deeply and peacefully. Their letters lay on their respective desks, testament to the power of honest words and open hearts. In their dreams, there were no more unsent letters, no more unspoken truths, only the quiet certainty that sometimes the greatest healing comes not from holding on, but from letting go. No ghosts of the past haunted their sleep that night. No restless thoughts kept them tossing and turning. Instead, they both rested in the peace that comes from truth finally spoken, from forgiveness finally given and received. Their story had come full circle, not to a fairy tale ending, but to something more valuable, genuine healing, and the freedom to move forward. The morning sunlight filtered through the hospital room's thin curtains, casting pale shadows across Jonah's bed. He had just finished his breakfast when Dr. Martinez entered, clipboard in hand and a serious expression on his face. The familiar morning routine of vital checks and medication reviews felt different today, heavier somehow. "Mr. Blackwell," Dr. Martinez began, pulling up a chair. "I've reviewed your latest test results, and I'm concerned about what I'm seeing." He paused, allowing Jonah to prepare himself. "The medication isn't managing your condition as well as we'd hoped. Your heart function has decreased further, and we're seeing signs of additional complications." Jonah's hands gripped the hospital blanket tightly. "What does that mean exactly?" "We need to consider a more aggressive treatment approach, specifically a surgical procedure called a cardiac ablation. It's a technique that can help correct the irregular heart rhythms, but—" The doctor hesitated. "Given your current condition, the procedure carries significant risks." The words hung in the air like heavy storm clouds. Jonah nodded slowly, processing the information while trying to keep his breathing steady, a skill he'd been practicing since his admission. "How soon would this need to happen?" Jonah asked, his voice quieter than usual. "We should make a decision within the next 48 hours. I'll have the surgical team come by later today to explain everything in detail." After the doctor left, Jonah sat in silence for several minutes, watching the morning traffic through his window. Then, with trembling hands, he reached for the notepad on his bedside table. Writing to Lena had become as natural as breathing over the past few days, but today's letter felt different. "Dear Lena," he wrote, then stopped. The pen hovered over the paper as he struggled to find the right words. Finally, they began to flow. "I received some difficult news this morning. The doctors say my condition has worsened, and they're recommending a risky procedure. I find myself thinking about our conversation in the garden yesterday, about faith and fear and facing truth head-on. I've spent so many years running from things that scared me. Now I'm facing something I can't run from, and I'm trying to find the courage you always seemed to have naturally." His handwriting grew slightly uneven as he continued. "I don't know what's going to happen, but I wanted you to know that your forgiveness has given me peace. I didn't think I'd ever find. Thank you for that gift." Iris arrived shortly after lunch, her face showing concern as she noticed her brother's subdued mood. She took the letter without her usual gentle teasing, sensing the weight of the moment. Across town, Lena was working in her small home office when Iris knocked on her door. The serious look on Iris's face made Lena's heart skip a beat as she accepted the envelope. Lena sat in her favorite reading chair, the one by the window where morning glory vines climbed the outside trellis. As she read Jonah's words, her hands pressed against her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. Without hesitation, she moved to her writing desk and began her response. "Dear Jonah, your news brings me to my knees. Literally. I stopped reading your letter halfway through to pray, and I want you to know I'll keep praying. Remember what David wrote in Psalm 56:3. When I am afraid, I put my trust in you. You're not alone in this fear, and you don't have to face it alone either. You mentioned my courage, but what you've always seen as courage was simply trust. Trust that God's plans are bigger than our fears. Trust that dawn follows even the darkest nights. You found that kind of trust, too. I saw it in your eyes yesterday when you spoke about wanting to live differently. I'm including a small card with more verses that have helped me through difficult times. Keep it close. Let the words remind you that you're held in hands stronger than your fear." Lena carefully copied several Bible verses onto a small card, her neat handwriting filling both sides. She slipped it into the envelope with her letter and asked Iris to deliver it immediately. When Jonah received Lena's response, he read it 3 times straight through. The verses on the card seemed to speak directly to his situation, and he found himself memorizing them without really trying. Throughout the afternoon, as different doctors came to explain the procedure and its risks, he kept one hand near the card in his pocket. As evening approached, Lena left her house for her daily walk. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of purple and orange, but her thoughts were far from the beautiful sunset. Her feet carried her along familiar paths, while her mind wrestled with possibilities she didn't want to face. She found herself at the small prayer garden behind her church, the same garden where she'd been leaving letters all these years. The roses were blooming, their sweet scent filling the air as she sat on a stone bench. Her fingers traced the rough surface of the bench, the same bench where she and Jonah had sat just yesterday, finding healing in honest words. "Lord," she whispered into the gathering dusk, "give him strength, give him peace." She closed her eyes, feeling the evening breeze against her face. "And give me strength too, if—" She couldn't finish the sentence aloud. The crickets began their evening chorus as Lena walked the paths between the flower beds. Each step felt heavy with the weight of uncertainty, yet she continued walking, just as she had continued writing all those years, one step, one word at a time. The garden's familiar shapes grew softer in the fading light, reminding her that some things remained constant even when everything else felt uncertain. She stopped at the garden gate, her hand resting on the iron latch. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring. Tonight she would pray, and trust, and remember that dawn always follows darkness. The evening air grew cooler around her as she stood there, preparing her heart for whatever might come next. The fluorescent lights of the operating room cast harsh shadows as nurses and doctors moved with practiced efficiency around Jonah's still form. His eyes had grown heavy under the anesthesia, the beeping of monitors creating a steady rhythm that seemed to slow with his consciousness. The last thing he saw before drifting away was the surgeon's kind eyes above her mask as she assured him everything would be fine. Miles away, Lena paced her small living room, her bare feet silent against the worn carpet. The clock on her wall ticked loudly in the quiet house. 9:15, 9:16, 9:17. She had already tried sitting, reading, praying while kneeling beside her bed, but nothing could settle the restless worry in her heart. In the operating room, the surgeon's voice was clear and calm. "Scalpel, please." The team worked with focused precision, their movements choreographed by years of experience. Monitors continued their steady rhythm, marking each beat of Jonah's heart as the doctors began their delicate work. Lena moved to her kitchen, warming water for tea she knew she wouldn't drink. Her hands shook slightly as she reached for a mug, and she pressed them flat against the cool counter to still them. "Lord," she whispered, "please watch over him." The kettle began to whistle, its high pitch cutting through the silence of her home. She turned off the burner but left the water untouched. Back in the hospital, tension filled the operating room as the surgeon encountered unexpected complications. "Blood pressure's dropping," a nurse announced, her voice steady but urgent. The surgeon's movements remained precise, unhurried despite the challenge. "We need to stabilize him before we continue," she directed, and the team responded instantly. Lena found herself in front of her bedroom window, looking out at the night sky. Stars dotted the darkness, and a nearly full moon cast silver light across her small garden. She remembered how Jonah used to point out constellations to her, his voice full of wonder at the vastness above them. Now she searched those same stars for comfort, her hand pressed against the cool glass. The surgery continued, each moment critical. Sweat beaded on the surgeon's forehead beneath her cap as she worked through the difficulty. The monitors beeping stabilized, returning to their steady rhythm. "Pressure's coming back up," the nurse reported, relief evident in her voice. The team continued their careful work, the immediate crisis past, but their focus unwavering. In her living room again, Lena pulled out her Bible, its pages worn soft from years of reading. It fell open to Psalms, and her eyes found familiar words of comfort. Her lips moved silently as she read, drawing strength from verses she had memorized long ago. The clock showed 10:45 now, and she wondered how much longer the surgery would take. Hours passed in the operating room, marked by the steady progression of careful work. The surgeon's skilled hands moved with purpose, making repairs that would give Jonah's heart a chance to heal properly. The team maintained their focus despite the late hour, each person committed to their role in saving this man's life. Lena had finally settled into her armchair, though her body remained tense with waiting. She had wrapped herself in a soft blanket, more for comfort than warmth in the mild night. Her phone sat silent on the table beside her, and she found herself checking it every few minutes, knowing it was too soon for news, but unable to stop herself. The surgeon began closing, her stitches neat and precise. "Pressure stable, rhythm regular," the anesthesiologist reported. The team's movements became less intense, but no less careful as they completed their work. Dawn was approaching, its pale light just beginning to show through the hospital windows. Lena had dozed off briefly, her head resting against the chair's back, when her phone's vibration startled her awake. Her heart jumped as she saw Iris's name on the screen. Her hands trembled as she answered, "Hello?" Iris's voice was tired but happy. "Lena, he made it through. The surgery was successful." She paused, letting out a long breath. "Recovery will take time. The doctor says it might be months before he's back to normal, but he's stable, and they're very optimistic." Tears of relief spilled down Lena's cheeks as she listened. She pressed her free hand to her heart, feeling its strong beats beneath her palm. "Thank you, Iris," she managed to say, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for calling." After ending the call, Lena remained in her chair as the first rays of sunrise began to paint her walls in soft gold. She closed her eyes, her body finally releasing its tension, and whispered, "Thank you, Lord. Thank you for watching over him." The relief flooded through her, like a gentle wave, washing away the fear and anxiety of the long night. In its place came a deep, peaceful gratitude that brought fresh tears to her eyes. As morning light filled her living room, Lena's whispered prayer of thanks rose with the dawn. The morning sunlight streamed through the hospital windows, casting long shadows across the polished floors as Lena made her way down the corridor. Her heart beat steadily in her chest, neither racing nor faltering. In her hand, she clutched her worn leather journal containing years of unspoken thoughts. The hospital's antiseptic smell mingled with the scent of fresh flowers that lined the hallway windowsills. Nurses moved efficiently between rooms, their rubber-soled shoes squeaking against the floor. Lena noticed how different this visit felt from all the times she'd imagined seeing Jonah again over the years. As she approached room 412, Iris emerged from the doorway. Her face brightened at the sight of Lena. "He's awake," Iris said, softly, touching Lena's arm. "Still tired from the procedure, but alert enough for visitors. I was just heading down to the cafeteria for some coffee." Lena nodded, appreciating how Iris understood their need for privacy without it being said. "Thank you for calling me last night," she replied. "I don't think I could have slept without knowing." Iris squeezed her hand before walking away, leaving Lena alone in front of the partially open door. She took a deep breath, smoothed her cotton dress, and stepped inside. The room was quiet except for the gentle beeping of monitors. Jonah lay propped up slightly on white pillows, looking smaller somehow in the hospital bed. His normally pristine business attire had been replaced by a pale blue hospital gown. Dark circles rimmed his eyes, but they were clear and alert as they met hers. "Lena," he said, his voice rough but warm. "You came." She moved to the chair beside his bed, setting her journal in her lap. "Of course I came. How are you feeling?" "Like I got hit by a truck," he admitted with a weak smile. "But the doctors say everything went well. Just need time to heal now." Sunlight played across his face, highlighting the silver threading through his temples, something she hadn't noticed during their garden bench meeting. The years had changed them both, but sitting here now felt strangely natural. "I brought something," she said, opening her journal. I thought maybe I could read to you for a while, if you'd like." He nodded, adjusting his position slightly. "I'd like that very much." Lena's fingers found the letter she'd chosen, not one of pain or accusation, but one she'd written on a quiet spring morning when her heart had finally started to heal. The pages crackled as she smoothed them open. "Dear Jonah," she began, her voice steady and clear. "The dogwoods are blooming again in the church garden. Their white flowers remind me of paper boats we used to make as children, setting them adrift with our dreams and wishes." As she read, the hospital room seemed to fade away. Her words painted pictures of morning sunshine and hope, of learning to find beauty in change and growth in letting go. She spoke of forgiveness not as a destination, but as a path walked one step at a time. Jonah listened without interrupting, his eyes sometimes closed, sometimes watching her face as she read. The monitors kept their steady rhythm, marking time like a metronome to her words. When she finished reading, the room fell into comfortable silence. Outside the window, clouds drifted across the afternoon sky, their shadows dancing on the wall. "Thank you," Jonah said finally. "I never knew you saw the world that way, with such grace." Lena closed her journal gently. "I had to learn to. It was the only way forward." He shifted, wincing slightly at the movement. "I wish I'd had your courage years ago. Running away seemed easier than facing the truth. We can't change the past," she said, her voice gentle, "but we can choose how we carry it with us." They sat together as the afternoon light began to soften, talking quietly about simple things: the weather, Iris's garden, the kind nurses on the floor. There was no need to rehash old hurts or make grand declarations. The peace between them felt like a gift neither had expected to receive. As the sun began its descent, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Lena gathered her things to leave. Standing beside his bed, she found herself smiling, not the sad smile of letting go, but the contented smile of someone who had found an answer to a long-held question. "Get some rest," she said. "Focus on getting stronger." Jonah nodded, his eyes heavy with medication and fatigue. "Thank you for coming, Lena, for reading to me, for everything." She paused at the doorway, taking in the scene one last time. The man she had once loved so desperately, now someone she could finally see clearly. The weight of unspoken words and unanswered letters had lifted from her shoulders, replaced by something lighter, cleaner. The hospital corridor was quieter now as she made her way out. Through the large windows, she watched the sun sink towards the horizon, painting the world in warm, gentle light. Her footsteps echoed on the tiles, steady and sure, carrying her forward into the evening. As she stepped outside, the sunset air wrapped around her like a familiar shawl. She stood for a moment, feeling the breeze on her face and the solid ground beneath her feet. Her heart felt different, not healed exactly, but transformed, like a river that had finally found its proper course. The parking lot was bathed in golden light as she walked to her car. She didn't look back at the hospital windows, didn't need to. The letter she'd read today had been about learning to let go, and now she understood that letting go didn't always mean losing something. Sometimes it meant making space for something new, not romance, but perhaps something equally precious: peace. The morning sun filtered through the hospital blinds, casting warm stripes across Jonah's bed. He sat propped up against white pillows, looking less pale than the day before. A small stack of get-well cards decorated his bedside table, along with a vase of fresh flowers Iris had brought. When Lena appeared in the doorway carrying a thermos, Jonah's face brightened with recognition. "Good morning," he said softly. "I brought some homemade chicken soup," Lena said, her voice gentle. "My grandmother's recipe. It always helped me feel better when I was sick." She set the thermos on his tray table and pulled up a chair. The familiar scent of herbs and chicken filled the room as she poured a small cup. Steam rose in delicate wisps. "The nurses said you could have clear liquids now," she explained, "so I made it extra light." "Thank you," Jonah said, accepting the cup carefully. His hands shook slightly, but he managed to take a small sip. "It's perfect." They sat in comfortable silence while he slowly finished the soup. Lena pulled out her worn Bible and opened it to a marked page. "Would you mind if I read something?" Jonah shook his head, settling back against his pillows. Her voice was steady and soothing as she read. "He gives strength to the weary and increases the power of the weak." The words from Isaiah filled the quiet room. The next day brought physical therapy. Lena arrived to find Jonah sitting in a chair beside his bed, his face tight with concentration as he practiced deep breathing exercises. "The therapist says I need to build my lung capacity back up," he explained between careful breaths. "Everything feels harder than it should." "Small steps," Lena reminded him, setting down another container of soup. "You don't have to rush." She stayed while he worked through his exercises, offering quiet encouragement when his frustration showed. Before leaving, she read from Psalms, "The Lord is my strength and my shield." Wednesday morning found Jonah standing shakily by the window, holding onto an IV pole for support. Lena knocked softly before entering. "3 laps around the nurses' station today," he said proudly, though his voice was tired. "That's wonderful." Lena smiled, setting up their now familiar routine of soup and scripture. Today she'd brought tomato basil, and the rich aroma filled the room. While he ate, she read from Philippians, "I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me." The words seemed to give him renewed determination. Thursday's visit was shorter. Jonah had just finished a demanding therapy session and was fighting sleep. Lena left the soup on his bedside table with a note containing the day's verse. "Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged." On Friday, she found him sitting up in bed, writing in a journal. "The counselor suggested it," he explained, closing the notebook as she entered. "Processing everything that's happened." Lena nodded, understanding the healing power of putting thoughts to paper. She served the soup, chicken noodle this time, and read from Corinthians about comfort and compassion. The weekend brought visible improvement. Saturday, Jonah was dressed in regular clothes instead of a hospital gown, sitting in the chair by the window. They shared soup and scripture, but also memories, careful ones, gentle ones, safely distant from old wounds. "Remember the church picnic where it rained?" Lena asked, smiling at the memory. "Everyone running for cover except Mrs. Patterson, who just kept eating her potato salad like nothing was happening?" Jonah's laugh was quiet but genuine. She said she wasn't about to let a little rain ruin her lunch. Sunday afternoon, Iris joined them. She brought fresh flowers and sat while Lena read from Romans about hope and perseverance. The 3 of them talked quietly about everyday things, the weather, the church garden, local news. The conversation felt natural, peaceful. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the hospital room, Jonah turned to his sister. His voice was thoughtful, steadier than it had been all week. "Iris," he said, "I've been thinking. All of this, the letters, the forgiveness, even this illness, it's shown me something important. I don't want to waste it." Iris leaned forward, listening intently. "I want to create something meaningful from this experience." Jonah continued, "I'm not sure what yet, but I know it needs to matter. To help others somehow." The last rays of sunlight painted the room in soft gold, illuminating 3 faces filled with quiet hope, each changed in their own way by the healing power of truth, forgiveness, and grace. Lena gathered her things, leaving behind the day's soup and scripture. The verse she'd chosen seemed especially fitting. "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future." The room was peaceful. As she stepped out, carrying with her the warmth of shared healing and the promise of continued growth. Though their paths had been painful, they had led to this gentle place of understanding and purpose. Through the hospital window, morning sunlight painted warm patterns across Jonah's bed. His recovery room had become familiar territory over the past week. The gentle beeping of monitors, the faint antiseptic smell, and the daily rhythm of nurses checking his vitals. But today felt different. His hands fidgeted with the edge of his blanket as he waited for Lena's usual morning visit. When she appeared in the doorway, carrying her customary thermos of tea and a small paper bag, Jonah's face brightened. "You're early today," he said, his voice stronger than it had been since the surgery. "The garden needed less attention this morning." Lena replied with a soft smile, settling into the chair beside his bed. She'd brought him homemade soup every day, each batch different from the last. "Today it's butternut squash with ginger," she said, pulling out a container. "The nurses said you're allowed real food now." Jonah nodded, but his mind seemed elsewhere. "Lena, I've been doing a lot of thinking during these quiet hours. About purpose. About making things right." He shifted in his bed, sitting up straighter. "Your letters. They weren't just words on paper. They were a lifeline I didn't know I needed." Lena's hand stilled on the soup container. "They helped me heal too," she said quietly. "That's exactly it." Jonah continued, his eyes bright with purpose. "Healing through words, through being heard. I want to create something meaningful from this experience, something bigger than just my own story." He reached for a folder on his bedside table, his movements careful but determined. "I've been working with my lawyers. I want to establish a foundation." His voice grew stronger as he spoke. "A foundation dedicated to supporting young women who feel unseen, who need their voices heard, just like you did all those years." Lena's eyes widened, and she set down her thermos with trembling hands. "Jonah, The foundation would provide writing workshops, mentorship programs, and safe spaces for expression." He continued, opening the folder to show her preliminary plans. "We'd focus on young women from underserved communities, help them find their voice through writing, just like you found yours through those letters." Tears gathered in Lena's eyes as she looked at the papers. "This is overwhelming," she whispered. "In the best possible way, I hope." Jonah said gently, "I want to turn our story of hurt into something healing for others. The foundation would offer scholarships, creative writing programs, and publishing opportunities. Every girl deserves to know her words matter." Lena dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. "The impact this could have," she began, her voice thick with emotion. "So many young women struggle to believe their stories are worth telling." "Exactly," Jonah said, reaching out to touch her hand briefly. "And I was thinking, if you're willing, you could help shape this. Your perspective, your experience with healing through writing. It would be invaluable." Lena took a deep breath, looking down at the plan spread before her. There were draft mission statements, program outlines, and preliminary budgets. "You've really thought this through," she observed. "I've had plenty of time to think lately," he said with a slight smile, gesturing to his hospital room. "And I want to do this right, make it something truly meaningful." They spent the next hour going through the details together. Lena suggested adding mentorship programs specifically for young Black women writers. Jonah nodded enthusiastically, making notes in the margins of his papers. "What about calling it Letters of Light?" Lena suggested softly. "Since it all started with letters, and it's about bringing hidden voices into the light." Jonah's face lit up. "That's perfect," he said, writing it down. "And maybe we could have a letter-writing program as part of it, teaching the power of honest, heartfelt communication?" "Yes," Lena agreed, her voice growing stronger with excitement. "And workshops on journaling for healing, creative writing for self-discovery." As they continued planning, the morning light grew brighter, filling the room with warmth. Nurses came and went, checking Jonah's vital signs, but neither of them paid much attention. They were too absorbed in their shared vision. "This feels right," Lena said finally, looking at the pages of notes they'd made together, taking something painful and turning it into hope for others. Jonah nodded, his expression peaceful. "It's more than just making amends now," he said. "It's about creating real change. Those letters you wrote, they weren't just about our story anymore. They were about the power of being heard, being understood, of having somewhere safe to put your truth." Lena added softly. "Exactly," Jonah agreed. He picked up the mission statement they'd crafted together and read it aloud. "Letters of Light Foundation exists to empower young women through the written word, providing spaces for their voices to be heard, their stories to be told, and their truth to be honored." Lena smiled, wiping away another tear. "It's beautiful," she said, "and it's real. We're really doing this." "We are," Jonah confirmed, gathering the papers together carefully. "Together, we're going to help other young women find their voice, just like you found yours through those letters." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both contemplating the journey that had led them here, from hurt to healing, from silence to purpose. The foundation would be their shared legacy, something meaningful born from years of unspoken words. Lena stood up, smoothing her skirt. "I should let you rest," she said, "but I'll bring more soup tomorrow, and we can work more on the program details." Jonah nodded, already looking tired but satisfied. "Thank you, Lena, not just for helping with this, but for showing me how powerful written words can be." "Thank you for listening," she replied simply, gathering her things. "Even if it took a while." As she left the room, both felt the rightness of their shared purpose. The foundation would be their way of turning past pain into future hope, their story becoming a light for others to find their way. The autumn sunlight streamed through the windows of the small community center, casting a warm glow over the modest gathering of women. Jonah sat quietly in the back row, his posture still careful from his recovery, but his eyes were bright with purpose. The past few weeks had transformed his vision into reality. The Unseen Letters Foundation was no longer just an idea scribbled in a hospital room. Lena stood at the simple wooden podium, her hands trembling slightly as she arranged her notes. She hadn't expected to be nervous. After all, these were just more words, like the hundreds of letters she'd written over the years. But speaking them aloud to a room full of strangers felt different. She looked up and caught Jonah's encouraging nod from the back. "When I started writing letters," she began, her voice soft but steady, "I never imagined anyone would read them. They were just drops of ink on paper, thoughts I needed to release into the world." She paused, gathering strength. "Every morning, I would walk to that little church garden mailbox, place another letter inside, and walk away feeling a little lighter." The women in the audience leaned forward, some dabbing at their eyes, others nodding in recognition. They were a diverse group, young college students, tired mothers, elderly widows, all drawn together by the universal experience of feeling unseen. "Those letters became my morning prayers," Lena continued, her confidence growing. "They taught me that healing doesn't always need an audience. Sometimes the most powerful changes happen in the quiet moments when we're honest with ourselves." From his seat, Jonah watched as Lena's words wrapped around the room like a warm embrace. His heart, now steadier after weeks of rehabilitation, swelled with admiration. The Foundation's mission was simple: to provide safe spaces, counseling, and writing workshops for women who needed to find their voice. But watching it come to life through Lena's story made it feel profound. Each letter was a step toward forgiveness, Lena shared, her voice growing stronger. Not just forgiving others, but forgiving myself for holding on to pain that wasn't serving any purpose anymore. She glanced at the letter in her hands, the one she'd chosen to share today. This particular letter was written on a morning when I finally understood that peace doesn't always look like what we expect it to. As she read the letter aloud, her words echoed in the hushed room. Dear Jonah, today I realized that sometimes the greatest act of love is letting go of the story we thought we were supposed to live. I'm not writing these letters to change our past or to hope for a different future. I'm writing them because every truth I put on paper helps me become more of who I'm meant to be. In the audience, a young woman wiped tears from her cheeks. An older lady reached over to squeeze her hand. The simple act of connection rippled through the room, creating tiny bridges between strangers who suddenly didn't feel so alone. Iris, sitting in the front row, beamed with pride. She'd watched this healing unfold from the beginning, carrying letters back and forth like a faithful messenger. Now she was witnessing how those private words were creating a public sanctuary for others to begin their own journeys. The foundation isn't about grand gestures, Lena explained, her gaze sweeping across the room. It's about honoring the small daily acts of courage it takes to face our truth, whether that's writing a letter no one will read, speaking words we've held inside for years, or simply showing up in this room today. Jonah shifted in his chair, touching the scar on his chest unconsciously. His physical therapy was progressing well, but he knew the real healing had happened through these weeks of watching Lena bring their shared vision to life. The foundation wasn't about their story anymore. It had grown into something bigger than both of them. We're calling it the Unseen Letters Foundation, Lena continued, because sometimes the most important words are the ones we write when we think no one is reading. But I've learned that even unread letters can change lives, first our own, and then, somehow, they find their way to others who need them most. She shared the Foundation's initial programs, weekly writing circles, counseling services, mentorship opportunities. Each element was designed to create space for women to find their voice, just as she had found hers through years of morning letters. The sunlight shifted, creating a gentle glow around Lena as she reached the end of her presentation. I stand here today not as someone who has all the answers, but as someone who discovered that healing often begins with a blank page and the courage to fill it with truth. As she looked up from her notes one final time, she saw faces filled with hope, understanding, and possibility. The room erupted in warm applause, the sound wrapping around her like an embrace. In that moment, standing before these women who had trusted her with their afternoon and their hearts, Lena felt the full circle of her journey. The clapping gradually faded, but its echo seemed to linger in the air. Lena remained at the podium for a moment longer, taking in the scene before her. Women exchanging phone numbers, hugging, wiping away tears, signing up for writing workshops. What had started as her solitary morning ritual had somehow multiplied into this, a room full of people discovering they weren't alone after all. She caught Jonah's eye across the room, and they shared a quiet smile of understanding. Their story hadn't ended the way either of them had once imagined, but it had transformed into something far more meaningful than a romance. It had become a gateway for others to find their own path to healing. As the last echoes of applause faded away, Lena felt a profound sense of rightness settle over her. Her letters, those private messages she'd written in the soft light of dawn, had become seeds of hope for others. In letting go of what she thought she wanted, she had found something she never knew she needed: the ability to help others feel seen, heard, and valued in their own journey toward peace. The late summer breeze rustled through the maple trees as Jonah Blackwell carefully stepped out of his sister's car. His movements were deliberate now, each step measured and thoughtful. The past weeks in the hospital had changed him, not just physically, but deep within his soul. "You sure you don't need help?" Iris asked, hovering nearby with concern etched on her face. Jonah shook his head, a gentle smile crossing his features. "I'm okay, sis. Just taking it slow." He straightened up, adjusting the light jacket he wore despite the warm afternoon. His body felt different now. More fragile, perhaps, but also more precious. The doctors had warned him about pushing too hard, too fast. As Iris drove away, Jonah stood for a moment outside his apartment building, taking in the familiar surroundings with new eyes. Everything seemed brighter somehow, more vivid. The red geraniums in the window boxes, the sound of birds in the nearby park, even the crack in the sidewalk he'd stepped over 1,000 times before. It all felt like a gift. Later that afternoon, he met Lena at their usual spot in the church garden. She was already there, sitting on their bench, her flowing summer dress catching the dappled sunlight that filtered through the leaves above. When she saw him, her face lit up with a warm smile that reached her eyes. "Welcome home," she said softly, standing to greet him. "It's good to be here," Jonah replied, easing himself onto the bench beside her. "Really here, I mean, present in the moment." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching butterflies dance among the late-blooming flowers. The garden had always been beautiful, but now it felt sacred, a place where healing had begun, where truth had finally been spoken. "I've been thinking," Lena said, her hands folded quietly in her lap, "about how different things are from when I first started writing those letters. I was so lost then, trying to find peace with unanswered questions." Jonah nodded, feeling the weight of those years. "And I was hiding behind my work, pretending I didn't need to face the past." He paused, looking down at his hands. "Sometimes I wonder how many years we wasted because I was too afraid, to be honest." "Not wasted," Lena corrected gently. "Those years shaped us both, led us here, to this moment." They began walking slowly along the garden path, past the roses Iris tended so carefully. Jonah's pace was unhurried, and Lena matched it naturally. The gravel crunched softly beneath their feet. "The foundation launch next week," Jonah said. "It's really happening, because you were brave enough to keep writing, even when you thought no one was reading." Lena smiled, touching a nearby flower petal. "It still amazes me how God can use our broken pieces to create something beautiful. Those letters were my way of holding on to hope, of choosing forgiveness even when it felt impossible." They rounded the corner where the old stone church stood sentinel, its weathered walls holding decades of prayers and promises. The mailbox came into view, that simple metal box that had become so much more than just a receptacle for letters. "I brought something," Jonah said, reaching carefully into his jacket pocket. He pulled out an envelope, cream-colored and sealed. "I thought maybe we could place it together." Lena's eyes softened as she recognized what it was. "The thank you letter to the church?" "For letting this mailbox become a sanctuary." He nodded. "For creating a space where healing could happen." Together they stood before the mailbox. Sunlight caught the edge of the envelope as they both held it, their fingers barely touching. The moment felt holy somehow, weighted with meaning. "Dear God," Lena whispered, "thank you for unanswered prayers that led to better answers, for silence that taught us to listen, for pain that shaped us into people who could understand forgiveness." Jonah's voice was thick with emotion as he added, "And thank you for second chances, for the grace to begin again." They opened the mailbox together, the familiar creak of its hinges like an old friend's greeting. As they placed the letter inside, both felt the profound symbolism of the moment, how this simple act of gratitude marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. "You know," Jonah said as they turned away from the mailbox. I used to think forgiveness meant forgetting. But it's not that at all, is it? Lena shook her head, her eyes wise and gentle. No, forgiveness is remembering differently, seeing the past through eyes of grace instead of pain. They walked back toward the garden bench, their steps slow but steady. The late afternoon light painted everything in warm gold, making the flowers glow like stained glass. A peace settled over them both, not the desperate peace they'd once sought, but something deeper and more real. I'm grateful, Jonah said simply, looking at the woman beside him who had taught him so much about grace. For every letter you wrote, for every truth you shared, for showing me what real forgiveness looks like. Lena's smile was full of quiet joy. And I'm grateful for answered prayers, even when the answers looked nothing like what I expected. They sat together on the bench as the sun began its descent, two people transformed by the power of forgiveness and truth. The mailbox stood in the distance, a humble guardian of their story, while all around them the garden bloomed with life and promise. The autumn breeze rustled through the church garden, scattering golden leaves across the worn stone path. Lena Whitcomb walked slowly, savoring the crisp morning air and the familiar crunch of leaves beneath her feet. The garden looked different now, not just because of the changing seasons, but because her heart saw it through new eyes. She held a letter in her hands, but this one wasn't written from a place of longing or loss. The paper felt lighter somehow, just as her spirit did. The morning sun caught the gold cross atop the church steeple, making it gleam against the pale blue sky. "Good morning," called a gentle voice. Jonah Blackwell emerged from around the corner, his pace measured and deliberate. The surgery had left its mark. He moved more carefully now, but there was a peace in his bearing that hadn't been there before. He wore a simple sweater and khakis, looking more like himself than the stern CEO he'd once been. "You're early today," Lena said with a warm smile. She noticed he was holding something too, a small leather-bound notebook. "Thought I'd catch the sunrise," he replied, gesturing to the bench they now shared without awkwardness. "The doctors say walking is good for recovery, and this garden—" He paused, looking around thoughtfully. "Well, it's become a special place." They sat together, comfortable in the morning quiet. A cardinal hopped nearby, pecking at fallen berries. Lena smoothed her letter against her knee, the paper catching the early light. "Another story for the foundation?" Jonah asked, nodding toward her letter. "Yes," she said. "A young woman wrote to me last week about feeling invisible in her own family. It reminded me of something I wrote in one of my old letters about finding strength in being seen by God even when others look away. I thought sharing that might help her." Jonah opened his notebook, revealing neat rows of writing. "The Foundation has received 37 letters this month alone. Each one carries so much hope, so much hurt. Sometimes I read them and think about all the years I spent avoiding truth, avoiding feelings." He shook his head. "What a waste." "Not a waste," Lena corrected gently. "A journey. Look where it led. To healing. To purpose. These young women who write to us, they need to know that growth takes time. That peace isn't found overnight." The morning light strengthened, warming their faces. A church bell chimed in the distance, its deep tones rolling across the quiet town. Jonah shifted on the bench, his movements more fluid than they'd been weeks ago. "My physical therapist says I'm making good progress," he said, answering her unspoken question. "The heart. Medication is working well. I'm learning to live at a different pace. Turns out it's not such a bad thing." Lena nodded, remembering the frantic phone call from Iris about the surgery, the long hours of prayer, the relief when he pulled through. God has a way of getting our attention sometimes, she said softly. They walked together toward the mailbox, their footsteps falling into an easy rhythm. The old metal box stood as it always had, but now it served a new purpose. Instead of holding one woman's private prayers, it collected stories of hope and healing from across the community. "Remember when you first found my letter here?" Lena asked, her voice touched with gentle amusement rather than pain. "Actually, Iris found it," Jonah admitted, a small smile playing at his lips. "She kept every single one safe until I was ready to face the truth. I never thanked her properly for that. She knew what we both needed: time, space, and eventually courage." Lena reached out and opened the mailbox. Inside lay several letters, each containing someone's story, someone's hope. Together, they added their contributions, Lena's letter of encouragement and Jonah's careful notes about the Foundation's progress. The simple act carried none of the weight it once had. Instead, it felt like planting seeds of hope. "The garden committee is meeting next week," Jonah mentioned, closing the mailbox carefully. "They want to add a prayer corner near the roses, with benches for reflection, a place where people can sit and write, or just be still." "That sounds perfect," Lena said, imagining others finding the peace she'd discovered here. "Every garden needs a quiet corner." They stood for a moment, watching as more sunlight spilled across the flowers. A group of sparrows swooped overhead, their wings catching the light. The morning felt full of possibility, of gentle promise. "I should head to the office," Jonah said. "We're reviewing applications for the Foundation's first scholarship program." Lena nodded, adjusting her scarf against the morning chill. "And I have a writing workshop to prepare for. Those teenage girls from the youth center are so eager to share their stories." "You're good with them," Jonah observed. "You show them that their voices matter." "Just as God showed me," she replied simply. They parted ways at the garden gate, no longer bound by unspoken words or painful memories. Their friendship had found its own rhythm, built on mutual respect and shared purpose, rather than the lingering echoes of old romance. Lena walked home alone, but not lonely. The morning sun warmed her face, and she felt the familiar surge of gratitude that often filled her heart these days. Her letters had evolved from desperate reaches across a void into bridges of hope for others. The pain that once drove her to write had transformed into purpose. As she reached her front porch, she paused to watch a pair of butterflies dance above her flower boxes. Their wings caught the light, reminding her of pages turning in the wind. She smiled, thinking of all the letters yet to be written, all the stories yet to be shared, all the healing yet to unfold. She was no longer the woman who wrote letters to an absent love. She had become someone stronger, a writer of hope, a keeper of stories, a witness to healing. The morning stretched before her, full of possibility, and her heart felt light and free. Inside her home, her writing desk waited by the window, sunlight pooling on its smooth surface. Her tea would steep while she worked, and words would flow not from longing, but from purpose. This was her calling now, not to pine for what was lost, but to help others find their way to wholeness. The morning breeze carried the distant sound of church bells, and Lena smiled, knowing that across town, Jonah too was beginning his day of service. They had found their separate paths to peace, united not by romance but by a shared commitment to helping others find their way out of darkness. She was whole, she was free, and most importantly, she was hopeful. Thanks for watching. If any part of this story lingered with you, consider subscribing. I'll be here again tomorrow, sharing another tale that speaks to the soul.